So if you're sitting in a high-stakes meeting right now and you're actively biting your tongue.
Right, just swallowing your frustration entirely.
Exactly. Hiding your absolute panic behind this, like, perfect professional poker face, you probably think you are just nailing it.
Oh, absolutely. You think you're being calm, you think you're being professional.
Right. But what if I told you that your poker face is actually causing the blood pressure of the person sitting across the table from you to physically spike?
Yeah, it is, it's one of the most counterintuitive findings in modern psychology.
It's wild.
You think you are doing everyone a favor by suppressing your negative emotions, but your brain is actually turning your internal stress into this contagious physiological event for the people around you.
Welcome to this deep dive. If you are listening to this, you're someone who learns, who grows, and who, inevitably faces stressful situations where you need to manage your emotions.
Which is all of us, right?
Literally everyone. Maybe you are prepping for a major presentation or navigating a complex personal relationship or just trying to survive the holidays with your extended family.
The ultimate test.
Seriously. And we constantly hear people throw around phrases like, just change your mindset or distract yourself or keep a stiff upper lip.
Right, these very common idioms.
Exactly. But we want to know, are these just fluffy psychological cliches? Or are there actual quantifiable physical changes happening in the architecture of your brain when you try to control how you feel?
And that is the exact mission we are embarking on today. We are going to map out the biological control panel of your emotions.
We're getting into the hard science.
We really are. We're taking a massive stack of neuroscientific literature, starting with foundational theories published back in 1998, all the way up to a huge 2019 functional magnetic resonance imaging meta-analysis.
We want to discover which emotion regulation techniques actually work, which ones completely backfire, and how they literally rewire your brain's networks over time.
Right, we're going to open up the hood of the brain. We want to look at the structural changes, the network connectivity, and the regional activations that happen when you regulate your feelings.
Because emotion regulation isn't just some soft skill you put on a resume.
No, not at all. It is a highly mechanical biological process. And, to operate that machine, we need the instruction manual.
So let's start at the absolute beginning. Because before we can even talk about how to regulate or change an emotion, we need to understand how an emotion is manufactured in the brain in the first place, right?
We do. If you don't know how the factory works, you don't know where to intervene on the assembly line.
Makes total sense.
So to get that blueprint, we turn to the foundational architecture of this entire field, which was built by Dr. James Gross.
Okay, lay it on us.
So in his seminal 1998 paper titled The Emerging Field of Emotion Regulation, an integrative review, which was published in the Review of General Psychology, and then later expanded in his 2014 works, Gross maps out what he calls the modal model of emotion generation.
The modal model. Okay, break that down for us. What does the assembly line actually look like?
It's a strict four-step chronological sequence. It always goes like this. First, situation, then attention, then appraisal, and finally, response.
Okay. Situation, attention, appraisal, response. I want to ground this in reality because abstract models can get a little dry.
Sure.
Let's build a scenario that every single person listening has experienced. Let's say it's 4:04 your EPM on a Friday. You are wrapping up your work, feeling good, and suddenly your phone pings.
Oh, no.
Right? It's a Slack message from your boss, and it just says, "We need to talk. Come to my office."
A universally terrifying experience.
Truly.
So that ping, that specific message, is the situation. It is a psychologically relevant event that has suddenly presented itself in your environment. But an event alone isn't an emotion.
Right, because if I just, if I don't look at my phone, I don't have a panic attack. I'm just happily oblivious.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Which brings us to step 2, which is attention. You hear the ping, you pick up the phone, and you direct your cognitive focus entirely onto that vague, ominous message.
My brain just locks onto it.
Yes, your attention acts as a spotlight. You are no longer thinking about your weekend plan. Your mental resources are completely locked onto the stimulus.
Okay, so situation, then attention. But I still haven't actually generated an emotion yet, have I? I'm just looking at words on a screen.
Right.
So step 3 is appraisal. What is happening in the brain right there?
Appraisal is the critical hinge point. This is where your brain acts as an incredibly fast, highly subjective, meaning-making
A
machine.
meaning-making machine. I like that.
You evaluate what this stimulus means to you and your personal goals. Your brain furiously searches for context. You think, I was 5 minutes late on Tuesday. The budget report I submitted had a typo. They're doing layoffs.
Oh man, the spiral.
Right, the spiral. You appraise the message not as a neutral request for a meeting, but as a direct existential threat to your livelihood and identity. You imbue the raw data with personal meaning.
And once I've decided that we need to talk actually means I'm getting fired and I will live in my car, the assembly line hits step 4, the response.
And here is where we really need to move past the pop culture definition of emotion. In that 1998 paper, Gross emphasizes that emotions are multi-componential processes.
Multi-componential, meaning there's a lot going on at once.
Exactly. The response isn't just that you feel sad or feel scared in your head. It is a massive, coordinated, whole-body biological event.
Right.
Experientially, yes, you feel a subjective sense of dread, but behaviorally, your facial expressions change, your posture slumps, or maybe you start pacing.
I definitely pace.
Right, and physiologically, your autonomic nervous system kicks into overdrive. Your amygdala sends a distress signal to your hypothalamus, which activates your sympathetic nervous system.
The fight or flight response.
Exactly. Adrenaline floods your bloodstream, your heart rate accelerates to pump more oxygen to your muscles, your pupils dilate, and your digestion completely shuts down.
All from a 5-word text message. It's
Huh.
really incredible when you frame it like that. So, situation, attention, appraisal, response. If that 4-step assembly line is how an emotion is generated, how does Gross define emotion regulation? Like, are we just trying to stop the assembly line entirely?
Not necessarily stop it, but rather alter its output.
Mhm.
In the Review of General Psychology paper, Gross defines emotion regulation as the process by which individuals influence which emotions they have when they have them and how they experience and express these emotions.
So it's about control.
Yes, it's about changing what he calls emotion dynamics.
Emotion dynamics. That sounds like a concept from, like, audio engineering, like twisting dials on a mixing board.
It is actually a brilliant way to conceptualize it. When an emotion triggers, it has a latency period how fast it kicks in. It has a rise time, how quickly it peaks to maximum intensity.
Right.
It has a magnitude, which is how objectively strong the biological response is. It has a duration, and it has an offset, which is how long it takes for your nervous system to return to baseline.
Okay, so twisting those dials.
Exactly. Emotion regulation is the act of reaching out and twisting those specific dials on the mixing board to optimize your state for the environment you are in.
So if we have this 4-step sequence situation, attention, appraisal, response, that implies we have different checkpoints where we can intervene, right?
Precisely.
If I want to stop the panic attack about the boss's text message, I don't just have one option. I have multiple intervention points depending on where I am in the timeline.
And that insight is really the crowning achievement of Gross's process model. It outlines the 5 families of emotion regulation interventions. You can intervene at any single point along that chronological timeline.
5 family, okay.
And the crucial takeaway for our listeners is that when you choose to intervene, biologically dictates how much collateral damage your brain and body are going to take.
Let's walk the listeners through these 5 families. I want everyone to literally picture this timeline in their head. Let's stick with the terrifying boss scenario.
Good idea.
The first intervention point is right at the beginning, before the event even happens. Family number 1 is situation selection.
Right. This involves taking actions that make it more or less likely that you will end up in a situation that gives rise to a specific emotion.
So in our scenario, what does that look like?
Well, maybe you know your boss is incredibly stressed and prone to lashing out on Friday afternoons. Situation selection would be intentionally scheduling all your one-on-one meetings with them for Tuesday mornings instead, actively avoiding the high-risk temporal environment.
You are dodging the bullet before it's even fired. It makes total sense. But let's say you can't avoid it. You are already in the situation. The meeting is happening. Family number 2 is situation modification.
Here, you are trying to alter the external environment to soften the emotional impact. Let's pivot to a different example to make this really clear.
Okay.
Say you are hosting your extended family for a holiday dinner. You know that politics always ruin the evening. Situation modification is physically removing the incendiary political magazines from the coffee table before people arrive,
Oh, I've absolutely done that.
or intentionally seating the 2 most argumentative relatives at opposite ends of the dining table. You aren't avoiding the dinner entirely, but you are modifying the physical and social parameters of the situation.
I think we've all done some aggressive seating chart modification in our lives. And just a quick note for the listener here, whether those magazines are left-wing or right-wing, the brain's stress response to family arguing is exactly the same. The goal is just to keep the peace.
Exactly. The biology doesn't care about the political party.
So true. But okay, let's say the situation is locked in. The boss called you in or the relatives are already arguing. You move down the timeline to family number 3, which is attentional deployment. You can't change the environment, so you change your focus.
Yes. This is where we start getting into internal cognitive mechanics. Attentional deployment is how you direct your focus within a given situation to influence your emotions. The most famous version of this is distraction.
Like looking at your phone during a really awkward elevator ride.
Precisely. Or in the boss's office while they are lecturing you, you might intensely focus on the pattern of their tie or start counting the books on their shelf.
Just totally zoning out.
Right. The threatening situation is still happening, but you are physically withdrawing your brain's spotlight from the threat and placing it onto something neutral.
Okay, moving further down the assembly line. The situation is happening, and you are paying attention to the threat. You can't look away. Family number 4 is cognitive change.
Now you are altering your appraisal of the situation. You are actively changing its meaning. Your boss is giving you harsh feedback. Instead of appraising it as, I am a failure and I'm being fired, you force a cognitive shift.
Like telling yourself a different story.
Yes. You tell yourself, this feedback is actually a roadmap for me to get a promotion next year. My boss is investing time and correcting me because they want me to stay.
Wow, okay.
The external facts haven't changed. The boss is still talking. But the internal meaning has been completely rewritten. The technical term for this specific type of cognitive change is cognitive reappraisal.
I love the idea of rewriting the script. It feels very empowering. But let's say you failed to do that. The script wasn't rewritten. The emotion has fully blossomed. The timeline has reached the end of the assembly line. Family number 5 is response modulation.
The whole body response has been initiated. The adrenaline is in your blood, your face is flushing, your hands are shaking. Response modulation is your final, desperate attempt to influence the physiological, experiential, or behavioral output as directly as possible.
So what does that actually look like in practice?
It could involve physiological interventions like taking deep diaphragmatic breaths to slow your heart rate or taking pharmaceutical beta blockers, but most commonly in human social interaction, it takes the form of expressive suppression.
The poker face.
Biting your lip, forcing a smile, and hiding the urge to cry or yell.
Okay, I want to pause here and synthesize this for the listener because understanding this timeline is basically the skeleton key to the rest of the neuroscience we are going to talk about. The first 4 families, situation selection, situation modification, attentional deployment, and cognitive change, are all what the literature calls antecedent-focused. They happen before the emotional bomb fully detonates in your body.
That timeline distinction is absolutely everything. Antecedent-focused strategies intervene before the emotional response tendencies have fully hijacked the nervous system.
While the last one, response modulation and specifically expressive suppression, is response-focused. The bomb has already exploded in the room. There is smoke and shrapnel everywhere, and you are basically just trying to throw a blanket over it so nobody else notices.
It is a very messy cleanup job. And the physiological toll of that cleanup job brings us to the core of the clinical research.
Let's dive right into that. We've got the timeline. Now let's zoom in on the 3 most heavily researched techniques in the cognitive neuroscience literature. The big 3. Cognitive reappraisal, expressive suppression, and distraction.
The heavy getters.
Yeah. We all get told to keep a stiff upper lip or don't let them see you sweat. Society heavily rewards the poker face. So let's start with expressive suppression. Give us the clinical breakdown of what is actually happening when we swallow our feelings.
So to understand the hidden costs of suppression, we have to look at a landmark 2002 paper by James Gross titled Emotion Regulation, Affective, Cognitive, and Social Consequences, published in Psychophysiology.
Yeah.
And we pair that with a brilliant 2014 comprehensive overview by Deborah Kutuli titled Cognitive Reappraisal and Expressive Suppression Strategies Role in the Emotion Regulation, an overview on their modulatory effects and neural correlates, which was published in the journal Frontiers in Systems Neuroscience.
Okay, those are serious papers. What do they reveal about the poker face?
They define expressive suppression as the volitional, conscious attempt to hide, inhibit, or reduce ongoing emotion-expressive behavior. As we just mapped out, it is a late-stage, response-focused strategy.
Right, the bomb has gone off.
Exactly. The emotion-generative process has already run its course. The subjective feeling of anger or sadness is there, The physiological arousal is peaking. The behavioral impulse to frown or yell is pushing outward.
So you're just fighting your own body.
Yes, you are simply erecting a dam at the very last millimeter of the process to stop the behavior from manifesting on your face or in your voice.
So what are the costs of building that dam? Because frankly, being able to hide your anger during a client negotiation seems like a pretty valuable survival skill in the corporate world.
Well, it might save the deal in the short term, but the biological and cognitive costs to the individual are staggering. First, there's the cognitive cost. Because the emotion is already actively firing, suppression requires continuous, relentless cognitive effort.
It's exhausting.
It really is. You have to consciously police your own face, monitor your tone of voice, and suppress microexpressions second by second. According to research by Gross and Richards, this continual outlay of cognitive resources acts like a massive background program running on your computer.
Just eating up your RAM.
Precisely. It drains your brain's processing power, leaving fewer resources available for actually processing the events happening around you.
Wait, meaning your memory takes a hit, like you actually forget things.
A massive hit. This is one of the most robust findings in the literature. Studies show that when individuals are instructed to suppress their emotions during a conversation, or even while viewing emotionally evocative slides, their objective memory for the information presented is significantly impaired.
That is crazy.
They cannot recall facts about the people they were talking to. They forget the names of the individuals in the interaction. Their brain is so overwhelmingly preoccupied with holding back the dam of emotional expression that it literally stops encoding external social information into memory.
That is wild. Think about the implications of that for you, the listener. Imagine you are in a highly tense performance review. You are receiving critical feedback, and you are trying so incredibly hard not to look defensive or devastated.
Right, you're just focusing on nodding and smiling.
Exactly. You are flexing every muscle in your face to look calm. And because you are doing that, your brain just stops recording. You walk out of the meeting and you literally cannot remember the specific feedback your boss just gave you. You sacrificed your memory for the sake of your facial expression.
And the tragic irony is that the sacrifice might not even work. Because the social consequences of suppression are deeply counterintuitive. You might think hiding your anger or anxiety makes the other person more comfortable. You're trying to be polite.
Right.
But Coutilli's 2014 review highlights experimental dyadic studies, which are studies involving two people conversing, where one member is secretly instructed to suppress their emotions. What the researchers found is that interacting with someone who is using suppression actually increases the partner's stress levels.
Okay, I have to push back on this, or at least ask for the mechanism. How does my partner's biology even know I am suppressing? If I have a perfect poker face, shouldn't they just think I'm chill? Why is my suppression spiking their blood pressure?
It is a brilliant question. It comes down to evolutionary biology. Human beings are exquisitely tuned social machines. For millions of years, our survival depended on accurately reading the emotional states of our tribe members to detect threats.
So we're always standing each other.
Always. We rely heavily on microexpressions, tiny, involuntary facial twitches that happen in fractions of a second, and vocal prosody, which is the natural emotional rhythm of speech. When you suppress, you are masking those vital social signals. Your face goes rigid. Your voice flattens.
You become a robot.
Exactly. But you don't become a perfect robot. There is a leakage of emotion. Your partner's autonomic nervous system subconsciously registers a discrepancy between your rigid outer expression and the subtle cues of tension in your posture or your eye movements.
So they feel that something is off.
Yes. They sense an incongruence. This lack of authentic feedback creates uncertainty. And to the human brain, social uncertainty is interpreted as a threat. The partner feels that you're not authentically tuned into the flow of the interaction, which triggers a sympathetic nervous system response in their body.
Wow.
Their blood pressure spikes because their brain is saying, something is wrong here, prepare for danger.
That is unbelievable. My attempt to be polite and stoic is biologically interpreted by my friend as a threat. And what about the person doing the suppressing? What happens to them over the long term?
For the person doing the suppressing, chronic use of this strategy leads to feelings of deep inauthenticity. They feel like imposters in their own lives. They report a lack of close social relationships, lower social support, and significantly higher rates of depressive symptoms. It is an incredibly isolating way to move through the world.
Okay, so suppression is basically a biological disaster. It ruins your memory, it makes you feel like a fake, it distances you from your friends, and it literally gives the people around you high blood pressure. It's a complete failure of a strategy. Let's look at the alternative. Introduce us to cognitive reappraisal.
Cognitive reappraisal is a form of cognitive change. It involves construing a potentially emotional eliciting situation in a way that changes its emotional impact. You are changing the meaning of the stimulus at the appraisal stage before the emotional response has fully formed.
As we mentioned earlier, it's rewriting the script. A classic example of this that always comes to mind is Walter Mischel's famous delay of gratification studies the marshmallow test with the kids.
Oh, perfect example.
The kids who successfully resisted eating the marshmallow didn't just stare at it and clench their fists and sweat. That would be suppression. Instead, they used reappraisal. They put a mental picture frame around the marshmallow. They imagined it was just a two-dimensional photograph or a fluffy white cloud rather than a yummy, chewy treat. They viewed it abstractly. They changed the meaning of the object in their mind.
That is a perfect illustration of the mechanism. Reappraisal is antecedent-focused. Because you alter the emotional trajectory early, it nips the emotion in the bud. The intense physiological arousal is never fully generated.
So you don't have to fight it.
Exactly. Therefore, it does not require that continuous, exhausting cognitive drain the suppression demands. You don't have to hold back a dam if you've already diverted the river.
Okay, so if suppression ruins memory and spikes your partner's blood pressure, what happens when you use reappraisal instead?
The outcomes are almost entirely inverted. Cognitively, reappraisal leaves your memory intact. In fact, some studies demonstrate it can actually enhance memory performance.
Wait, how is that possible? If you are busy reframing the event in your head, aren't you distracted from remembering it?
It has to do with something called the levels of processing effect. To successfully reappraise a situation, you have to engage in a deep semantic analysis of the stimuli. You have to actively think about the context, the people involved, and the possible meanings of the event.
Oh, I see.
This deep cognitive engagement inherently acts as a rehearsal mechanism, encoding the information much more firmly into your memory banks.
That makes total sense. And socially.
Socially, the benefits are equally profound. Individuals who habitually use reappraisals share more of their emotions appropriately, form closer relationships, and experience much more positive affect.
Yeah.
And crucially, when they interact with others, their conversational partners do not experience those autonomic blood pressure spikes. The interaction feels fluid and authentic.
Okay, so reappraisal is clearly the gold standard for long-term health. It's the ultimate life skill. But I want to throw a wrench in this, because we have a third major player here, which is distraction. Shifting your attention away from the stimulus entirely. Doing a complex math problem in your head, or scrolling TikTok when you feel anxious, or staring at the ceiling tiles when you are getting a painful shot at the doctor's office. How does distraction stack up against reappraisal?
This brings us to a really fascinating showdown in the literature. We look at a critical 2010 paper by Philip Kansky and colleagues titled How to Regulate Emotion, which was published in the Journal of Neuroscience. Kansky essentially set up a neurological cage match.
A cage match. I love it.
He directly compared reappraisal and distraction inside an fMRI scanner to see which strategy is actually more effective at cooling down the brain's emotional fire.
The ultimate showdown. Okay, which one won?
Well, the finding is deeply nuanced, and it depends entirely on your time frame and the intensity of the emotion. While reappraisal is undeniable for long-term well-being, Kansky's study found that distraction actually caused a stronger decrease in amygdala activity than reappraisal in the short term.
Wait, stop. I have to push back here. Everything in modern pop psychology and therapy culture tells us not to distract ourselves from our feelings. We are told to sit with our emotions, to feel our feelings, and that distraction is just avoidance. Are you telling me that playing a video game or doing a crossword puzzle during a panic attack is actually neurologically sound?
I am telling you that the neuroscience paints a very pragmatic picture of cognitive load. In Kansky's study, participants were placed in the scanner and shown highly evocative, negative emotional pictures. In the reappraisal condition, they were asked to intentionally reinterpret the meaning of the image to feel less negative.
Like the picture frame.
Right. But in the distraction condition, they weren't asked to change the meaning of the image at all. Instead, they were given a highly demanding arithmetic task to solve while the image was present.
So they are staring at a disturbing image, but trying to subtract 7 from 100 over and over again.
Correct. The results show that both strategies successfully reduced subjective ratings of negative emotion and lowered activity in the bilateral amygdala. But the direct contrast, the statistical comparisons between the two methods showed that the arithmetic task caused a significantly stronger, faster decrease in amygdala activation.
Why does math beat reappraisal in a crisis? Like, what is the actual mechanism there?
It is the mechanism of finite cognitive capacity. The brain has a limited amount of working memory. Think of it as RAM in a computer. Generating a complex emotional response requires a certain amount of that computational power. When you engage in a highly demanding cognitive task, you are hijacking the brain's executive
You're
networks.
stealing the RAM.
Exactly. The arithmetic completely absorbs the cognitive resources that your brain would otherwise use to generate and sustain the emotion. Your brain simply doesn't have the computing power left to feel terrified if it is desperately trying to carry the 2 and subtract the 7.
So why is this relevant for the listener? How do we apply this in real life?
It is a critical tool for triage. For highly intense, immediate, short-term stress, distraction is incredibly effective. This is particularly relevant for populations struggling with severe emotion dysregulation, such as those with borderline personality disorder, bipolar depression, or severe panic disorder.
Because the emotion is just too hot.
Right. Sometimes an emotion is so hot, so overwhelmingly intense, that attempting to cognitively reappraise it is literally impossible. The prefrontal cortex, the logical brain, is just overwhelmed by the amygdala. In those acute crisis moments, trying to reframe a panic attack is futile. Distraction is the best emergency brake you have to bring the nervous system back below the threshold of absolute overwhelm.
Wow.
Once the system cools down, then you can apply reappraisal.
I want to make sure we have this absolutely clear. I'm going to try an analogy here. Think of your emotional response as a boiling pot of water on a hot stove.
Okay, I'm with you.
Suppression is like forcefully slapping a heavy lid down onto that boiling pot without ever turning down the heat. The heat is still blazing, the water is violently bubbling, the pressure is building exponentially. It takes a massive amount of physical energy to hold that lid down, and eventually the pot is going to explode and someone is going to get burned.
That's very accurate.
Reappraisal is reaching out and turning down the dial on the stove. You are lowering the heat at the physiological source. The water calms down organically, the pressure dissipates, and you don't have to fight it.
It's spot on.
But distraction. Distraction is like stepping out of the kitchen entirely and walking into the living room to solve a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. The pot might still be on the stove, the burner might still be on, but you have completely removed your attention and resources from the room. The pot can't boil over because you unplugged the stove to plug in your puzzle lamp.
It is an elegant way to visualize the allocation of cognitive resources. Reappraisal alters the heat source. Distraction starves the system of the attention it needs to boil.
So we know how these techniques feel subjectively, and we know their behavioral and social outcomes. But here is where we get to the absolute core of this deep dive. What do these techniques actually look like inside the physical tissue of the brain? Let's dive deep into the neuroimaging to look at the regional activation and structural changes that occur.
Let's do it.
Let's start with the bad one. What does the brain on suppression look like?
To see this, we look at a pivotal 2008 paper by Philippe Golden and colleagues titled The Neural Basis of Emotion Regulation, Reappraisal and Suppression of Negative Emotion, published in the journal Biological Psychiatry.
Okay, what do they do?
When you instruct a human being in an fMRI scanner to suppress their emotional expression to hold that poker face while watching a disturbing video, we see a massive surge of activation in a specific region called the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, or right VLPFC.
The right VLPFC, what is the day job of that specific brain region?
The VLPFC is heavily associated with volitional response inhibition. It acts as the brain's braking system for motor actions. It is the exact same region that fires when you are about to say a swear word in front of a child, but stop yourself at the very last millisecond.
Ah,
Or when you are playing a game of Simon Says and you have to suppress a prepotent physical movement. So the fMRI proves that suppression is not a passive state. It is an intensely active neurological process. You are burning massive amounts of metabolic energy to apply the motor brakes to your face and vocal cords.
okay, the brakes are on. But what about the emotion centers? What is happening to the heat on the stove?
And here is the neurological proof of suppression's failure. The fMRI data shows that despite the VLPFC working overtime to apply the brakes, suppression has absolutely no impact on the activation of the insula and the amygdala.
Wow, they are still just firing away.
Completely unmitigated. Let's define those regions. The amygdala, as many know, is a core hub for threat detection, fear conditioning, and emotional arousal.
The alarm bell.
Exactly. The insula, or insular cortex, is heavily involved in interoception, which is the brain's ability to represent the subjective, visceral experience of what is happening inside the body. It's the region that maps your racing heart and your churning stomach. During expressive suppression, both the amygdala and the insula remain blazing hot.
So the brain's threat alarm is screaming, And the brain's internal monitoring system is fully aware of the panic.
Precisely. This aligns perfectly with the subjective reports. When you ask people who are actively suppressing how they feel, they report that their internal negative experience remains entirely intact. They feel terrible, there is suffering in silence, and the functional brain scans provide the smoking gun. The internal neurochemical cascade of stress is unchecked.
Okay, so suppression lights up the motor braking system but leaves the panic centers on fire. What about distraction versus reappraisal? Let's go back to that Kansas 2010 study. If they both work to calm the amygdala, do they use the exact same brain networks to achieve that calm? Or are there different neurological paths to peace?
They share a common foundational network, but they diverge in fascinating ways based on their distinct mechanisms. Both strategies heavily rely on common cognitive control areas, the medial and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, as well as the inferior parietal cortex.
Okay.
You can think of these regions as your brain's executive management team. They are responsible for directing traffic, allocating attention, and holding rules in working memory. But that is where the overlap ends.
Let's break down the distinct paths. What does distraction uniquely activate?
Distraction specifically engages the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the DACC, and large expansive clusters in the parietal cortex. This network is heavily involved in focused, external attention and task execution. By heavily engaging this specific network with an arithmetic problem, the brain monopolizes its own processing power.
The bottleneck.
Exactly. It limits the extent to which the emotionally evocative aspects of a stimulus can even be attended to. You're creating a neurological bottleneck, and the math problem is taking up all the space, leaving no room for the emotional imagery to pass through to the amygdala.
And what about reappraisal? What makes rewriting the script neurologically unique? If it's not a bottleneck, what is it?
Reappraisal selectively activates a region called the orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC.
The OFC. Tell us why that region is the key to reframing.
The OFC sits just above the orbits of your eyes. It is an incredibly sophisticated region that is absolutely crucial for updating the momentary relevance and changing the meaning or valuation of a stimulus. The OFC integrates sensory information with memories and expectations to compute the current value of a situation.
So it's actively assessing.
Yes, when you look at a photograph of a snarling dog and you consciously tell yourself, this is just a pixelated image on a screen, it cannot physically bite me, I am safe inside an MRI scanner, you are using the OFC to actualize your present context. You're reversing the emotional meaning of the stimulus from threat to neutral object.
That's incredible.
Furthermore, reappraisal uniquely modulates activity in the subgenual ACC and the ventromedial PFC. These are areas deeply involved in integrating emotional valuation with decision-making. You aren't just ignoring the threat like in distraction, you are fundamentally altering the neurocomputational math of how dangerous the threat actually is.
Okay, this is blowing my mind, but I have a major question, maybe even a skepticism about how we apply this. Up until this point in the deep dive, everything we've talked about is functional activity. We are talking about the brain lighting up differently in the moment. We are talking about transient blood flow changing second by second based on the task you were doing.
Okay, short-term changes.
But what about the long term? If a listener uses reappraisal all the time, if they are a habitual silver lining seeker, if they consciously reframe their thinking every single day, can the psychological strategy they choose actually alter the physical size, like the structural anatomy, of their brain?
It absolutely can. And this shifts us from functional neuroscience into structural neuroplasticity, which is one of the most profoundly empowering findings in the field. Let me introduce a 2012 paper by Nicole Giuliani, Emily Drabin, and James Gross titled Anterior Cingulate Cortex Volume and Emotion Regulation is Bigger Better, published in the journal Biological Psychology.
Is bigger better? It's a great question. How did they actually measure if a brain was bigger? You can't just weigh it while they're alive.
They used a highly sophisticated imaging methodology called voxel-based morphometry, or VBM. They took high-resolution anatomical MRI scans of 50 healthy subjects.
Let's translate that for the listener. What exactly is a voxel, and what does this morphometry process do?
Think of a two-dimensional pixel on your computer screen. Now turn that pixel into a tiny three-dimensional cube. That is a voxel.
Okay, a 3D pixel.
Right. An MRI scan maps the entire brain in these tiny 3D cubes. VBM is a complex computational technique that measures microscopic differences in the local concentration and volume of brain tissue, specifically the gray matter, which contains the cell bodies of your neurons, voxel by voxel, across the entire brain.
Wow.
It allows researchers to statistically compare structural anatomy to see if certain brain areas are physically thicker, denser, or larger in some people compared to others.
So they took these incredibly precise 3D maps of 50 brains, and then they gave these people standardized psychological questionnaires to determine how often they use cognitive reappraisal or expressive suppression in their daily real-world lives.
Yeah.
What was the verdict?
They found a direct positive correlation. Individual differences in the habitual use of cognitive reappraisal were positively related to the volume of the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the DACC.
Wait, really?
Yes. The more a person reported habitually reframing and reappraising their emotions in their daily life, the larger the physical volume of their DACC gray matter.
That is staggering.
It is. And crucially, to prove this wasn't just a fluke of general brain size, the volume of a control region, the ventral ACC, was not related at all. Furthermore, the habitual use of expressive suppression and the experience of negative affect were completely unrelated to DACC volume. The structural thickening was highly specific to the habitual practice of cognitive reappraisal.
Wait, I really want the listener to grasp the gravity of this. We aren't just talking about blood flow changing. We're talking about literal, physical, structural changes. More brain volume, more actual gray matter tissue in the DACC for people who habitually reframe their thinking. It is literally like a muscle getting bigger from lifting weights in the gym.
That is the exact mechanism of experience-dependent neuroplasticity. The brain is not a static organ. The neural pathways and regions you engage most frequently strengthen. They form new dendritic connections, increase synaptic density, and in some cases, literally expand in macro volume to accommodate the chronic processing demand.
It's adapting to the workload.
Exactly. The DACC is heavily implicated in cognitive control, conflict monitoring, and the top-down regulation of emotion. By constantly calling upon it to monitor your emotional state and initiate a cognitive reframe, you are essentially putting that specific brain region through a daily resistance training workout.
That reframes everything about daily stress. It means how you choose to think about a frustrating traffic jam or a delayed flight is actually building the physical architecture of your brain. So if emotion regulation is this biological control panel, and we can literally build up the wiring through practice, it begs the dark question: what happens when the wiring is faulty?
That's the other side of the coin.
What happens when the control panel breaks down? To understand the extreme end of the spectrum, we need to look at what happens when emotion regulation fails entirely.
A necessary pivot. When we examine psychopathology, particularly clinical anxiety disorders, we aren't just looking at people who are choosing to worry or who have a weak mindset. We are looking at brains where the biological control panel have systemic, structural, and functional network disruptions. The hardware is malfunctioning.
Right. And to understand the architecture of anxiety, we can't just rely on one or two studies. We need the big data.
We need the absolute pinnacle of evidence. I want to dive deep into a 2019 systematic review and meta-analysis by Tiffany Colasar and our colleagues, published in the journal Neuroimage Clinical. The paper is titled Systematic Review and Meta-Analyses of Neural Structural and Functional Differences in Generalized Anxiety Disorder and Healthy Controls Using Magnetic Resonance Imaging.
A meta-analysis. Just to clarify why this matters for the listener, a single fMRI study might only have 20 or 30 college students in it. It can be noisy, but a meta-analysis takes dozens of independent studies from around the world, pools all their data together, and runs massive statistical models on the combined data set to find the ultimate undeniable signal hiding in the noise.
Exactly. Colasar's team started with over 4,600 scientific records and meticulously narrowed it down to the 85 highest quality neuroimaging studies comparing individuals diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, to healthy controls.
That's a massive data set.
It is. This meta-analysis encompasses structural VBM analyses, functional connectivity analyses, and task-based fMRI activation analyses. It is arguably the most comprehensive map we have of the clinically anxious brain.
Okay, let's explore this map. Break down the network disruptions for us, because the brain doesn't just have one anxiety spot, right?
Correct. The brain operates in large-scale, distributed networks. Colasar's review highlights profound disruptions across 4 major networks in the GAD brain. First, let's look at the default mode network, or DMN.
What does that one do?
This is the network that becomes highly active when you are at rest, when you are mind-wandering, daydreaming, or thinking about your past and future self. In individuals with GAD, the meta-analysis shows a significant reduction in the volume of the hippocampus.
The hippocampus, that's the memory center. Why would anxiety shrink the memory center? And how does that actually affect the person's daily life?
The shrinkage is likely a result of cortisol neurotoxicity. Chronic anxiety floods the brain with stress hormones like cortisol, and the hippocampus is extremely sensitive to cortisol. Prolonged exposure actually damages dendritic branches and kills neurons.
Oh, wow, it literally kills the cells.
Yes, functionally, this is devastating because the hippocampus is responsible for providing context. If you see a dog that looks like a dog that bit you 10 years ago, a healthy hippocampus immediately retrieves the memory context to say, that was 10 years ago, this is a different dog on a leash, you are safe. A reduced hippocampus struggles to provide that safety context, leaving the threat signal unmitigated.
That makes so much sense. The context engine is basically broken. What is the second network?
The salience network. The job of this network is to constantly scan the external environment and your internal body states to detect what is salient, important, or threatening. It is your brain's radar system. In GAD, there is reduced physical volume in both the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, and the amygdala.
Wait, pause. I'm confused. You just said the amygdala volume is reduced in generalized anxiety disorder. I thought anxiety meant the amygdala was hyperactive. Wouldn't it be bigger and stronger? Like the muscle analogy we used earlier.
It is a brilliant observation, and it highlights a crucial paradox in neurobiology.
Yeah.
Structural volume and functional activity are not the same thing. While the physical structure of the amygdala might be reduced again, potentially due to the toxic effects of chronic, lifelong stress, the task-based functional data in this exact same meta-analysis confirms that individuals with GAD show hyperactive emotion-generating regions.
Ah, I see.
The amygdala shows massively increased activity when the person is faced with emotional stimuli.
So it's like a smaller, damaged engine that is constantly being redlined and revved to the maximum.
Precisely. Smaller hardware, but the software is overclocking it into overdrive. It is highly reactive, but structurally compromised.
Okay, so the context engine, the hippocampus is shrinking, and the threat radar, the amygdala, is redlining. What about the control centers? The prefrontal areas we talked about using for reappraisal, are they stepping in to help?
This brings us to the third disrupted network, the Central Executive Network, or CEN. This network includes our old friend, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC. This network is responsible for top-down cognitive control, working memory, and executing regulation strategies.
So they should be putting on the brakes.
They should be, but the meta-analysis reveals a profound systemic deficit here. But it's not just about regional activity, it's about the wiring between regions. The DLPFC and the ACC show significantly reduced functional connectivity with the amygdala.
Reduced functional connectivity. Explain what that means in a practical sense.
Functional connectivity measures how the activity in one brain region correlates with the activity in another over time. If they rise and fall together, they are communicating, they are sharing information. In a healthy brain, when the amygdala detects a threat and fires up, the prefrontal cortex immediately talks back to it, applying reappraisal and saying, calm down, it's just an email, you aren't dying. But in GD, those communication lines are frayed. The top-down emotion processing is deficit.
The cables are cut.
Exactly. The neural cables connecting the logical executive brakes to the emotional fearful engine are structurally and functionally disconnected. The prefrontal cortex might be trying to send a calming signal, but the signal never reaches the amygdala.
That is tragic, but also incredibly validating for anyone suffering from anxiety. It's not that you aren't trying hard enough to calm down. The physical cables sending the calm down signal are literally degraded. You mentioned a fourth network.
Yes, the sensorimotor network, which handles movement, motor planning, and sensory feedback from the body. The meta-analysis found greater pre- and post-central volume, reduced supplementary motor area volume, and altered connectivity in the cerebellum in GAD patients.
Why does an emotion regulation disorder affect the motor and movement networks?
Because, returning to Gross's 1998 definition, emotion is a whole-body physiological response. Anxiety is an action state. It prepares the body to fight or flee. The altered sensorimotor network explains the brutal physical symptoms of GAD.
Like the muscle tension.
Exactly. The chronic muscle tension in the neck and jaw, the physical restlessness, the inability to sit still, the profound physical exhaustion. The anxiety isn't just in their head, it is deeply structurally wired into their motor systems. Their body is constantly braced for a physical impact that never comes.
Okay, this brings it all together beautifully. The 2019 data shows that clinical anxiety isn't a personality quirk. It is a measurable breakdown. But if the communication lines are broken, how does the anxiety sustain itself? If nothing scary is happening in the room, Why does the GAD brain stay panicked?
And that leads to a fascinating and somewhat terrifying nuance about the nature of pathological worry.
Mhm.
The Colasar Review discusses a conceptual framework from a 2017 paper by Fonzo and Etkin. They point out that in GAD, pathological worry and anxiety can be, and often are, generated without any external stimulation whatsoever.
Meaning there is no boss's text message, there is no scary dog, there is no external situation.
Precisely. Returning to Gross's modal model of situation, attention, appraisal, response, the situation has become entirely internal. The anxious brain is constantly generating its own internal threat signals through intrusive thoughts or catastrophic what-if scenarios.
Just a loop of worry.
Right. And because the threat is internally generated, the neural state becomes somewhat insulated or less impacted by external stimuli.
So even if they are sitting on a peaceful beach in Hawaii, the brain is generating its own horror movie.
Yes. The brain is trapped in a closed loop of self-generated fear. The reduced connectivity to the prefrontal cortex means the individual is unable to use the external context of the peaceful beach to reappraise the internal threat. The biological control panel is essentially locked out from the inside.
That is a profoundly intense visualization of what anxiety truly is.
It really is.
Let's take a deep breath and synthesize this entire deep dive. We have traversed an immense amount of territory, starting from the 1998 foundational modal model to the complexities of 2019 fMRI meta-analyses. We started with the idea that the world of psychology and emotion regulation seems murky and subjective, but we found that it is, in fact, incredibly mechanistic.
It is a machine, and we've learned that intervening early in the assembly line of that machine is fundamentally different biologically from intervening late.
So, if you are listening to this, here are the concrete takeaways for your daily life. First, suppression, biting your tongue, hiding your face, and pretending you aren't upset when you are, is a blunt, costly, and ultimately toxic instrument.
Absolutely.
It spikes your partner's blood pressure by creating social threat signals, it ruins your memory of the interaction, and your internal amygdala is still blazing away. It is a biological fail. Stop doing it unless it's an absolute necessity.
Couldn't agree more.
Second, distraction shifting your focus to a demanding puzzle or a complex task is an incredible, highly effective short-term hack. If you are acutely overwhelmed or having a panic attack, shifting your cognitive load to a demanding math problem will literally cool down a blazing amygdala faster than trying to logic your way out of it. It stars the emotional fire of the computational oxygen it needs to burn.
A perfect short-term tool.
Yeah. But third, cognitive reappraisal, actively reframing the meaning of the event. Rewriting the script of what the threat actually means is the ultimate gold standard long-term strategy. It intervenes early, it costs less metabolic energy, it preserves your memory, and it facilitates authentic social connections.
The best investment you can make.
And most amazingly, if you practice it habitually, it may literally increase the physical gray matter volume of your brain's cognitive control centers, like the DACC. It is lifting weights for your emotional resilience.
A perfect summary.
Oh.
And if I may, I'd like to leave the listener with a final lingering idea to mull over based on all of this structural neuroscience. We know from Giuliani's VBM research that habitual reappraisal is linked to increased DACC volume. We also know that the brain is a highly neuroplastic organ.
Right, it physically changes based on the behaviors we choose to repeat.
Exactly. So think about the seemingly insignificant annoyances you face every single day. The frustrating commute, a rude passive-aggressive email from a coworker, a long, slow line at the grocery store.
Microstressors.
Yes. If the psychological strategy you choose to apply to those microstressors today is actively shaping and sculpting the physical gray matter of your brain, are your daily, seemingly harmless emotional habits actually pre-programming how much anxiety you will experience a decade from now?
Wow.
Are you accidentally building a brain wired for suppression and chronic panic? Or are you actively building a brain wired with a thick, robust, highly connected DACC capable of calm reappraisal?
That is a heavy, empowering thought. It means every time you get cut off in traffic, it's not just a fleeting annoyance, it's a rep in the gym. You are consciously choosing which brain network to flex and strengthen.
Exactly.
We started this deep dive talking about x-rays and broken bones and how we wish our emotions were that simple and visible to diagnose. Well, it turns out the x-ray machine isn't broken. We just needed to look at an fMRI instead. And what we see isn't a static, unchangeable bone. We see a living, breathing neuroplastic network that you are actively rewiring every single day with every thought you choose to reframe. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.